Erev Tov, everybody. A pleasure to welcome Dr. Rebecca Winter Gottlieb from originally her mother's in Toronto, but she's in Atlanta, where she is the principal of Atlanta, the Judaic Studies principal of Atlantic Jewish Academy, a PhD in neuropsychology, which she also practices a GPAT. She graduated with I don't know what it's called, Morah Halacha program in Lindenbaum, and really a true embodiment of Torah Umada and all its manifestations. Always interesting and a pleasure to hear her learn. And so we're looking forward to our Parsha Shir tonight. And we get double Shir. I didn't tell you it's a 2 hour Shir, right? One for Chukat and Balak. I
Oh,
forgot to
right, right. Oh, sorry.
add
Yes,
that in.
everyone, we're here for 2 hours.
Okay, 2 hours today. Chukat-Balak. We're finally going to catch up with those people in Israel who got ahead of us for a while. Okay, Rebecca
Exactly.
Bakasha.
Exactly. Excellent. Thank you so much, Rabbi Kelman. It's wonderful to see everybody here on our double parsha, like Rabbi Kelman said, Chukat-Balak. And we are finally going to catch up to Israel. We're going to touch a little bit on both parshiot this week. And we're going to start off by talking more about Parshat Chukat, but we're also going to touch on Balak. So I'm actually going to share my screen so I can share my slides, which I always make. Um, just give me a second. Uh, Sorry, one second. Oh, here we go. I always forget how to do this. Portion of screen. Okay. Wonderful. All right. Can everybody see the slides? We can get a thumbs up from anybody. Excellent. Thank you, Rabbi Kalman. All right. So, as Rabbi Kalman said, we're going to be learning about Chukat and Balak. The title of the shir today is Enemy or Brother. I'm not going to be checking the chat during the shiur, so feel free to drop questions in, but at the end, I'm going to give a chance for questions and feel free to ask, and I'm going to answer as best as I can. So the title of our shiur today, Enemy or Brother, and I'm going to just quickly do a brief recap of the parshiot that we're going to be talking about today. Parshat Chukat, which really actually starts off with the Para Aduma, but we're going to move on from Para Aduma, and we really get started in Parshat Chukat with the death of Miriam and Mei Meriva, where Aaron and Moshe are afterwards told that they're not going to be allowed into Eretz Canaan, into Eretz Israel. We have this encounter with Edom, which we're going to focus quite a bit on today. Then that's followed by Aaron's death and the war with Canaan Melech Arad, where we have our first real war, I guess, aside from Amalek, really one of our first wars that we fight as a nation. Followed by the Nechashim Astrafim, the copper snake, a war with Sichon, a war with Og. So we're fighting many wars. And of course, that moves us into the Bilam and Balak story, which is Parshat Balak, and how we deal with Moab. Now, just to note about where we are, kind of the time period of where we are in the Midbar, last week we were in Parshat Korach, but many Parshanim really read these Parshiot, Chukat and Balak, as we've skipped ahead, really, this 38 years. And now we are in a time period where Bnei Israel are about to enter into Eretz Israel. And they're a very different nation from the nation that they were 38 years prior, where they were a nation of slaves. And now they're a nation that's on the precipice of entering into their own land and conquering and being able to own and being able to lead and have sovereignty in their own land. So that's kind of where we are, just to give a background. And like I said, we're going to focus here on our encounter with Edom. So I'd like to get into that part of our parsha, of Parshat Chukat, when Bnei Israel are traveling from Kadesh and they encounter the king of Edom. So I'm going to read that portion of Parshat Chukat, and we'll read it. You can follow along in the English, feel free. Vayishlach Moshe melachim mikadesh el melech Edom. And so Moshe sends messengers to the king of Edom. Ko amar achicha Yisrael, ataya data et kol hatzla'a asher matzatanu. So Moshe sends messengers to Edom. He says, "We're your brother. this is what your brother Israel says. You know all the hardships that have befallen us. Vayardu avotenu Mitzrayma, v'nashev Mitzrayim yamim rabim, vayareu lanu Mitzrim v'lavotenu, v'nitzak el Hashem, vayishma kolenu, vayishlach malach, v'yatzienu Mitzrayim. So Moshe is really going through, he's telling Edom about all the whole history of Bnei Israel. And now we find ourselves, after all these trials and tribulations, that we were in Mitzrayim, we went down, we became slaves, we cried out to Hashem, He took us out, and now we find ourselves on the border with Edom. And so we're asking now, Brana ba'artzecha lo na'avar b'sadeh v'kerem v'lo nishtei me be'er derech hamelach ne'elech lo nita yaminu smal ad asher na'avor gvulecha. So please let us go through your land. Let us go. We're not going to bother you. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to walk through any fields. We're going to walk straight on the highway. Vayomer alav Edom lo ta'avor bi pem b'cher v'tzeli kratecha. So Edom says, no, you're not allowed to pass through my land. I'm going to, lest I come out and greet you with a sword. Vayomru elav bnei Yisrael b'msila na'aleh v'im emecha nishteh ani u'miknai v'natati michram. And Bnei Yisrael say, no, really, we're just going to go on the highway, like on the beaten track, Mesilah. And if we drink anything, or if our cattle drink anything, we'll pay for it. Rak ein davar b'raglecha avor. Vayomer, and so Edom says, lo ta'avor, vayetze Edom likrata ba'am kaved uveyad chazaka. And Edom comes out with an army. He's like, you're not allowed to go through my land. He comes out with a big army. Vayima'en Edom netana Yisrael avor bigvulov vayet Yisrael me'alav. And Edom refuses to let Bnei Yisrael through, and so Bnei Yisrael turn away from Edom. So this is our encounter with Edom, who is they are descendants of Esav, which is why Moshe calls them our brothers, Achicha. And Bnei Israel are trying to pass through the land. Why? Because Edom is situated here to the south of Bnei Israel, of Eretz Israel, Eretz Canaan. And it would be easy, Bnei Israel are somewhere around here in Kadesh, and it would be easy for Bnei Israel to enter into Eretz Israel from the south. So they're asking to pass straight through Edom. So they're not going to bother Edom. They just want to use their land to go right through. And because Edom says no, actually, they go around Edom, forcing them to go somehow through Moab or Ammon, which they also don't end up doing. So they have to kind of come up here and end up through the east, coming in through Yericho. So because Edom said no, it really prolongs their journey, actually, through Eretz Canaan to Eretz Canaan. And it's very frustrating. In fact, many Parshanim say that this is why right afterwards Bnei Israel start complaining again, which leads them to the plague of the snakes, which we will not really talk about today. But this is their encounter with Edom. Edom says no. And it seems like a pretty cut and dry interaction that Moshe or his messengers have with Edom. And it's actually recounted in Sefer Dvarim. And this happens very frequently. Sefer Dvarim, which comes, the book that comes after Sefer Bamidbar, oftentimes recounts or tells us the same story again. And we're going to read the story of Edom from the Sefer Dvarim perspective. And I find it fascinating because it very barely really resembles the story that we just read now in Sefer Bamidbar about Bnei Israel's encounter with Edom. So here's the retelling in Dvarim. Here's how Dvarim chooses to tell us about the same story of Edom. So ve'et ha'am tzav le'mor, and Moshe is saying, here's what Hashem said to me about Edom. Atem ovrim bigvul achechem. You are going through the border of your achim, of Esav, bnei Esav, hayoshvim b'seir, vayir'u mikem v'nishmartem me'od. And they are very afraid of you. And so you should be very careful. Al titgerubam, ki lo eten lachem me'artzam, ad midrach kaf raglecha, ki aresh le'esav natati et har seir. Don't disturb them, don't do anything, because their land I'm not giving to you. This is the land for the people of Esav. Ochel tishberu mi'itam bekesef ve'achaltem v'gam mayim tichru mi'itam bekesef u'shatitem. If you get any food from them, if you get any water from them, you should give them money. Ki Hashem Elokecha berechecha b'chol ma'aseh yadecha yada lechtechad hamidbar gadol hazeh 40 shana hazeh zeh 40 shana Hashem Elokecha imach lo chasarta davar. Because Hashem has never withheld anything from you in the midbar. ונעבור מאת אחינו בני עשיו היושבים בשעיר מדרך הערבה מאילת ומעציון גבר. And so we proceeded away from Esav, from Bnei Edom. And so this is how Dvarim recounts the story. And it's drastically different from Sefer Bamidbar. In Sefer Bamidbar, Edom is presented as strong, coming out with an army, rejecting Bnei Israel's request. Here in Dvarim, Edom is presented as very meek, very afraid. We should be very careful. We should tiptoe around them. And even in the story, it's unclear. Maybe Bnei Israel even traveled somehow on the outskirts of Edom. Of Edom, right? It's possible that Bnei Israel even actually went somehow through their land. But certainly there was no mention of Edom coming out angry, coming out with a sword, coming out with an army. And so the obvious question with this encounter with Edom, these two accounts of Edom, is why does Dvarim so drastically change the narrative of our encounter with Edom? Why does Dvarim come and decide to change the story so significantly? And so today we are going to talk about this question, and we're going to use 3 different approaches of how to address this contradiction in the Tanakh. There's 3 basic ways, 3 classic ways that I or many people usually approach apparent contradiction specifically in the Torah. And the first one is what we call the authorship hypothesis, or the authorship hypothesis or biblical criticism. Many people here may be familiar if you've heard. And this is an approach that's classically taught in college campuses, university campuses, among many biblical critics and biblical philosophers, that the Torah was written by different authors. And so the JEPD, our approach, that there were multiple authors of the Torah. And so different authors contributed differently to the Torah, and different stories in the Torah are told in different ways because of different authorship. Now, of course, in the Orthodox Jewish community, that's not an opinion that we hold. We see the Torah written by Hashem. That is our strongly held belief. And this is not a hypothesis that we hold by, but it is a popular hypothesis that helps solve when there's contradiction, seeming contradiction in the Tanakh. And in this case, this hypothesis would say that one story in Dvarim was written by one author, and another story in Bamidbar was written by a different author. So that is option number 1. Number 2 is what we call harmonization. Harmonization is an idea that was developed by a philosopher and rabbi named Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. He lived in the early 1900s in Germany, and his idea really is that he looked at the different parshanim, our classic parshanim, Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, Rashbam. And what he noticed is that what they try to do when there's contradiction in the Tanakh is they'll try to take aspects of both stories and meld them together to form one coherent story. And so says Rav David Tzvi Hoffman that if we look at Rashi, for example, in this story, he says, Lo le'inyan la'avor ba'artsam, ela li'inyan mecher ochel umayim. So he says, really the true story here is that in Dvarim, we're not talking about passing through the land, because of course Bnei Israel didn't pass through the land, but this is a matter of selling food and water. Meaning, in both cases, we talked about Edom selling food and water to Bnei Israel. And so in both cases, that makes sense. And in both cases, too, Bnei Israel don't pass through the land. And really, what the story is trying to say is that we did pay for food and water, but we did not pass through their land. So he sort of takes a detail from both stories and puts it together to harmonize the story. Maybe a better understanding of this is really by the Ibn Ezra, who says that the stories themselves are talking about two different groups of people. And the story in Bamidbar is talking really about the king of Edom, and he says this here. I highlighted for you. Rak hamelech shehu melech Edom lo azvam sheya'avru derech medinata. Only the king said that Bnei Israel couldn't pass through his land, but the rest of the people, the rest of the Edomites of Bnei Esav said, sure, it's totally fine. Please come through my land. And so it's possible, says the Ibn Ezra, that the story in Bamidbar was talking about the king Edom, and the story in Dvarim is referring to all the people of Edom who said it's totally fine. And so we're talking about just two different groups of people, but really the stories come together as one strong story. That's the idea behind harmonization. The third approach, which is the approach that we'll spend the most time on today, is called Shitat HaBechinot, or the method of perspectives. And this is the approach that's put forward by Rav Mordechai Breuer, also originally from Germany, and of course made Aliyah to Israel. He passed away, I think, in 2007, so much more contemporary perspective. And he says when there is apparent contradiction in the Torah, as we see in this story, when there's apparent contradiction, really what Hashem is trying to do is show us the same story from two different perspectives. And why is the Torah doing this? Well, because each location that the story is written in has a different message, has a different thesis that it's trying to put forward. And so Bamidbar has its own set of agendas, and that's why it's presenting the story of Edom in one way, in a more war and aggressive form of Edom. And Dvarim has also its own message and its own thesis and its own agenda. And that's why in Dvarim, Hashem through Moshe, is presenting the story in a different way, maybe a more passive, maybe a friendlier form of Edom. And so in order to understand this perspective of Rav Mordechai Breuer, we of course have to understand what is the thesis of Bamidbar that would drive a more aggressive form of Edom, and what is the thesis of Dvarim that would drive a more friendly, a more brotherly type of Edom. And so the source in Bamidbar I found, and there's many different theses that people have different opinions on what Bamidbar may think is, what Bamidbar's thesis really is. But I found Erica Brown, who wrote a wonderful book on Sefer Bamidbar. And she says the Midbar is a provisional bridge between points of stability that can untether us if we stay too long. This book deals with the transition and uncertainty that Bnei Israel faced, having recently left servitude in Egypt and now finding themselves in the middle of a vast, seemingly untamable wilderness. So says Erica Brown that the Bamidbar is talking about Bnei Israel in the Midbar, which is a place of danger, a place of uncertainty, and it's full of different tests and trials. And the whole purpose of Sefer Bamidbar is trying to understand how the leadership of Bnei Israel and how the nation of Bnei Israel deal with these challenges that they face. And so every story, says Dr. Brown, every story that's put forward in Sefer Bamidbar is going to be presented from a perspective of challenge. How do Bnei Israel grapple with the challenges that they face? And that is the idea behind Sefer Bamidbar. So of course, in this case, we're showing a challenge where we approach a nation in a brotherly, friendly way, and understanding how the leadership then decides to back away from Edom. And that's how we responded to the challenge in Bamidbar. Dvarim has a very different thesis, very different perspective, very different bechina. And I brought this perspective from Micha Goodman, who is a philosopher in Israel, and he wrote a book, The Last Words of Moses, on Sefer Dvarim. And he says Dvarim is really the purpose of Sefer Dvarim is that Bnei Israel are about on the precipice of becoming a nation of great political power or regional political power. They're coming from a place of a nation of slaves, and they're about to very quickly ascend to a place of political power. And says Micha Hoffman that the purpose of Sefer Dvarim is to help Bnei Israel accept that power with limitation, how to act in a moral and ethical way when we hold power. And so here I wrote as a summary, maybe Sefer Dvarim is really about how we behave toward other nations as a regional power and how we face the different physical and ideological threats that are going to happen to us when we enter into Eretz Canaan. And so from this perspective, it would then make sense that maybe this second telling of the Edom story doesn't focus on Edom as the aggressor, but focuses us on a potential power that's coming in and disrupting Edom and explaining to us that there are some borders that really we shouldn't cross. Edom owns their own land, and we should not disturb them and we should not bother them. We are the power. We have to understand our own limitations and grapple with those. And so that those are three different ways of grappling with this seeming contradiction. And the truth is that was one contradiction in the Torah, but there are many, many, many contradictions in the Torah. Another one comes up, of course, in Parshat Balak. The way that Parshat Balak explains and describes our relationship with the nation of Moab, with the Moabites, is very, very different in Bamidbar and Dvarim. And I brought the first few psukim for you here, but of course we know the story of Balak ben Zippor. He was the king of Moab, and he's very worried and afraid of Bnei Israel. And so he hires Bilam, famously from Midian, and he hires Bilam, and he hires Bilam to curse Bnei Israel in order to shake them, in order to scare them, in order to weaken Bnei Israel, so that he, Balak Melech Moab, can conquer Bnei Israel, and Bnei Israel would no longer be the power that they were. And that's how Moab is presented in Sefer Bamidbar. Of course, we know Bilam in the end does not end up cursing Bnei Israel, but nevertheless, Moab is successful in weakening Bnei Israel through the horrible sin of Baal Peor. And many, many people die due to the Avodah Zarah that they do, the licentiousness that goes on. 24,000 people are killed in the plagues that follow these horrible sins that were really brought on by Moab. And that's how Moab is presented to us in Sefer Bamidbar. Moab and Dvarim is almost given very, very little airtime, but it's very similar actually to how Edom was presented. So I brought these psukim again from Dvarim Perek Bet. Moab and Dvarim, it says, Vayomer Hashem Eli, Hashem says to Moshe, Al tatzer et Moab, va'al titgar ba'milchama, ki lo eten lecha me'artzo Yerusha, ki livnei lot natati et ar Yerusha. And Hashem says to me, don't bother Moab, don't harass the Moabites. I'm not going to give you any of their land, because just like Edom, they are also their family, they're descendants of Lot, and they have their own Yerusha, so don't bother them. Again, we have this contradiction. We have this difference in presentation, rather, maybe not a contradiction, in the way Moab is presented as aggressors very much in Bamidbar, and much more as a nation who potentially could be bothered by Bnei Israel, and that we should not bother them because of maybe our familiar relationship in Sefer Dvarim. And so in the same way that we solved this issue between Edom in Sefer Bamidbar and Sefer Dvarim, we can use the same strategies to solve the issue of Moab in Sefer Bamidbar and in Sefer Dvarim. So that's all very nice. And just as a recap, Bamidbar maybe is asking what happened, what did it feel like to live through this at the time, the difficulties and the tests that we were put through. And in Dvarim, we're really thinking more retrospectively, what should this new generation learn from what happened? Okay. Now, this is all well and good that we have maybe a narrative of Sefer Bamidbar and a narrative of Sefer Dvarim, and we can understand through the Shitat HaBechinot why we may approach the same story in different ways depending on the book that we're talking about. The problem is that toward the end of Sefer Dvarim, both Edom and Moab are revisited again, this time in Perek Kaf Gimel, all the way toward the end of Sefer Dvarim. Sefer Dvarim brings up both nations again, and I've been just very fascinated by how they are presented at the end of Sefer Dvarim. Famously, we know that a Moab or someone who descends from Moab or Ammon is not allowed to enter into Kal Hashem. They're not allowed to be gay. They're not allowed to convert into Kal Hashem. Why? It talks about Moab. It says, Al davar asher lo kidmu etchem belechem uvemayim baderech b'tzeitchem mimitzrayim, because they didn't give you food and water when you left Mitzrayim. It's actually hard to find a source for that, but it seems that in Sefer Bamidbar, instead of greeting us and maybe helping us out in the desert, instead Moab rejected us. Ve'asher sachar elecha et Bilam ben Beor miptor aram naharaim lekalacha. And because they hired Bilam, like we said, in order to curse us. Okay, so we have two reasons why we're supposed to reject Moab. They're not allowed to enter into Kal Hashem, into Bnei Israel. Both of these reasons, very, very much, are in line with the narrative of Moab, not from Sefer Dvarim, but from Sefer Bamidbar, the aggressors, the antagonistic form of Moab. Not the Moab of, oh, they're our family, they're Lot's descendants, but the Moab of, they didn't give us bread and water, they hired Bilam, terrible. Okay. Then a few psukim later, we hear about Edom. And let's see how Dvarim, at the end of Dvarim, presents us with Edom. It says, Lo tita'ev adomi ki achichahu. Don't bother, don't abhor the Edomite. Why? Because he's your brother. And that's how Dvarim leaves off with Edom. And it's very surprising to me because, and I think surprising to most people, because it's surprising that the end of Dvarim would treat Moab so much more harshly than Edom, when really both, we know, were presented as a type of aggressor. It's unclear why Edom gets this special brotherly status, but Moab does not get the same familial status. But really, my real question is, why does the end of Dvarim choose the Bamidbar narrative, the aggressor narrative, to remember Moab? But the end of Dvarim instead chooses the more familial or the nice narrative to remember Edom, and doesn't remind us, oh, they came out and they tried to wage war against you. Instead, it says, they're your brother, achichahu. And so we have a split in our memory, in our narrative. The end of Dvarim seems to be telling us, with Moab, you need to remember what they did to you back in Bamidbar. And with Edom, for some reason, we need to remember that there are brothers, and not necessarily to remember what they did to us back in Bamidbar. And so it's a difficult question. I'm going to attempt to answer it tonight with a few different reasons. I don't actually think I have a great answer. I'm not 100% sure, but I would like for you to think about this question. Bamidbar, Dvarim is clearly making a choice, choosing one narrative specifically for Moab and a different narrative for Edom, but there's an inconsistency here. And it's unclear to me why Dvarim would choose to do this, why the end of Dvarim would choose for us to remember Moav and Edom differently in this way. Okay, so one potential possibility is that Moab are descendants of Lot, as we know, and there is a theory that Lot, when he was back in Stum, and I have spoken about this, so maybe you've heard me say this before, but Lot, when he was back in Stum, he encountered the two visitors from Abraham. They came to his house. They were going to save him from Stum, which famously Hashem was about to destroy in Perek Yud Tet in Sefer Bereshit. And when Lot invites these two angels or these two men into his house, it says umatzot afa, that he makes them matzah, which is wonderful. Rashi immediately jumps on this pasuk, which I brought for you, pasuk Gimel from Perek Yud Tet in Bereshit. And Rashi jumps on this and says, why did Lot make matzah for these two people? Because he says Pesach Hayah, it was Pesach. So of course Lot made matzah. Of course, this doesn't make sense because Pesach was at least hundreds of years after the story of Lot with the Melachim of Sdom. And so Rav Yoel bin Nun, he says, well, obviously it wasn't Pesach. It's that Lot was experiencing his own form of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Instead, it was called Yetziat Sdom. And so, according to this theory, and Rav Yoel bin Nun, he really goes through this, he fleshes this out in a beautiful shiur, and I brought you just one table to show you the similarities between the story of Sdom and the story of Pesach. We won't go through it really in point form today, but what he does, I gave it to you so that you could trust me, but what he does is he shows that there are many similarities between the story of Sdom and the story of Pesach. Some of them, I'll just tell you briefly, which they're very beautiful, are that the story of Sdom has a really beautiful focus on the Petach Habayit, on the doorpost, that there's so much action and activity that happens around the doorpost, and also that right outside Lot's house, there's a lot of danger. The people of Sdom are rioting. They want Lot to give his daughters to have them cross over the doorpost. And Lot stays inside. The Melachim pull him back inside. The Anashim pull him back inside. In the same way, the door is very important in the Yetziat Mitzrayim story because if Bnei Israel leave their houses, the Mashchit can get them in the story of Makat Bechorot, and they paint their doorposts with the blood to stay inside the door. That's the safe zone. Rav Yoel bin Nun talks about the importance of the word lihitmamea, that they were not able to wait, or they had to rush in both cases out of Sdom and out of Mitzrayim. There's also, we have in the story of Sdom, we have this motif of the barad, of like the hail coming down that has fire in it, which is very reminiscent of the barad, of the hail of the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. In both cases, there's memory. Hashem remembers Lot through Avraham, and of course, Hashem remembers Bnei Israel also through Avraham. So there's a lot of similarities, says Rav Yoel bin Nun. But what's most important is that the purpose of Yetziat Mitzrayim, or one of the key purposes of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that's repeated many, many times in Sefer Shmot, in Sefer Bamidbar, and Sefer Dvarim, is to remember what happened to us, that we were slaves in Eretz Mitzrayim. But more importantly, it says many times, Lo tanu et hager, you should not oppress those outsiders or the people who are outside your community. Ki atem yadatem et nefesh hager, because you know what it's like to be somebody who is an outsider. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you yourself were gerim in Eretz Mitzrayim. You were outsiders in Mitzrayim. And so it's possible that Lot, or the Yetziat of Sdom, should have evoked the very same lesson, the very same message. Lot should have been able to pass on to his child, to Moab, that they should also be nice, or they should not oppress those who are outsiders. They had an opportunity to learn the lesson of Gerim Hayitem, and they did not learn the lesson. They were not hospitable to Bnei Yisrael, even though they have a heritage and they have a legacy of Yitzia. They have a legacy of being let out and being saved, and of being strangers in a strange land and stum. Lot was unsuccessful in passing their Yitzia message on to them. So says Rav Yoel Binun. And so maybe this is an idea. This helps us answer why Moab is treated more harshly than Edom. Edom did not have this opportunity for Yitzia. Moab did. So maybe the Torah is telling us here in Dvarim, we're going to be harsher with Moab than Edom, because we have an expectation of Moab that we don't have of Edom. Maybe that's potential possibility number one. I want to bring us to a Rashi, an interesting Rashi on these psukim in Sefer Dvarim, where Rashi also tries to answer this question. He brings in four nations: Moab, Edom, Ammon, Edom, and Mitzrayim, who are all mentioned in this section, but we're only really focusing here on Moab and Edom. And he says this: Ha lamadta, here we learn, shehamachti la'adam kashe lo min hahorga. Someone who causes someone else to sin, it is worse than somebody who just tries to kill him. Why? Shehahorga horga ba'olam hazeh. Somebody who kills him, he eliminates him from this world. V'hamachti'ah. But somebody who causes him to sin, motzi'ah min ha'olam hazeh umin ha'olam haba. He forces him to leave not just this world, but this world and the world to come. Lefichach Edom shekidmam b'cherev lo nitav. That's why Edom, who came out with a sword, who tried to destroy Bnei Yisrael physically, lo nitav, they are not totally rejected. V'chen Mitzrayim shetibum, and of course the Mitzrayim also. Ve'elu shehechtium nitavu. But those, Ammon and Moab specifically, who caused them to sin, they are rejected completely. And so maybe what Rashi is saying here is there's a difference between physical threat and maybe ideological or existential threat. And it's possible, according to this Rashi at least, that we would treat the ideological or existential threat much more harshly than only a physical threat. And this is actually an idea that's said and that's brought about throughout all of Sefer Dvarim. There's a consistency here that in Sefer Dvarim, the threat that we're most worried about, or that is presented as the strongest worry, is not really the threat to us as the physical threat to us as a nation, but rather the cultural threat to us as a nation, the ideological threat to us as a nation. It says over and over again, we must destroy the other gods. We must destroy the cultures of all the Amei Kna'an. We're not allowed to marry them. We're not allowed to take on any of their customs. Perhaps the most extreme example of this is the Ir Hanidachat, which is a city in Bnei Israel. If Bnei Israel see a Jewish city that is sinning and that has turned to other gods, they have to utterly destroy that city. And I quoted Micha Goodman here. He says, the violence that the Torah commands is not just directed at other nations. It is also directed at any Jews who worship idols. Any subversive city must be destroyed, and anyone who worships idols must be killed, even if the worshiper is a member of Israel. The lands of Canaan must be cleansed completely of paganism. Only then can an ordinary nation succeed in forging an extraordinary culture. And so says Micha Goodman that if we're trying to develop a culture that is radically different from an immoral or paganistic or um, excuse me, or ethically abhorrent culture that the Ame Knan were putting out, then we sometimes have to destroy them completely, but we have to destroy even that within ourselves, which is putting forth that culture. And so I think that ties very much into what Rashi is saying, that the Torah here in Dvarim views anything that may butt up or that may seek to destroy us ideologically or ethically as a nation as far worse than anything that will try to destroy us only physically. And so we come here, we see maybe the idea is that Edom threatened our security, but Moab really threatened our identity as a people. And the question that Dvarim is trying to answer is what dangers should Bnei Israel remember when they enter Eretz Canaan, and what truly endangers our covenant with Hashem. And when we look at the two, at Moab and Edom, what's important to remember about Moab is that they did threaten our covenant in what they did to us through Balak, through Bilam, through Baal Peor. And Edom threatened our security, but that's not as important to remember. In fact, maybe there are times that there are nations who threaten our security, but it's still important to try to hold the ties with them. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs writes in his article, it's called The Other Face of Esav, and he quotes Rav Kook. I won't read it here. But what he says essentially is that maybe it's so important, even though Edom came out, and even though they came out against us, and even though they were our aggressors, similar to the story of Esav and Yaakov, we still should try to seek some kind of reconciliation sometimes. And Rav Kook says this as well. Maybe we need to seek reconciliation even when there is a threat to our to us physically. And it reminds me really, if we go back to the very, very beginning, when we were talking about the summary of our Parshiot, and we think about the very beginning of our Parshiot, I find it very interesting that the Parsha starts really with a death in our family as Bnei Israel. We lost our leader, we lost Miriam. And I find it interesting that the Edom story comes in the middle of the death of two siblings, Miriam's death and Aaron's death. It's kind of sandwiched by them. And if we think about ourselves as we approached Edom, where we were as a nation, we had just lost Miriam. We just went through Mei Merivah. We just found out that we were losing very imminently our two other leaders, Aaron and Moshe, as a result of Mei Merivah. And we knock on Edom's door, and we knock on their door like brothers, like a younger brother maybe. We knock on their door, we're saying we're hurt, we're in a hard place. Please open the door for us. And maybe like a typical older brother, Edom is like, no, you're bothering me. I'm frustrated with you. I'm not coming to open the door for you. Get out of here. But that type of encounter and that type of narrative doesn't necessarily destroy a relationship completely. Even though Edom, yes, they were aggressive, and even though they did threaten us physically, and even though they behaved in that way, it doesn't mean that the entire relationship is completely destroyed. And Moshe, it's possible in Sefer Dvarim, he refuses to let the defining narrative of Edom become a rejection. Instead, he insists that Edom is Achichahu. That's what we should remember about Edom.
Yes, it's 7.
And oh, sorry, do you mind?
United States. No.
Sorry. And maybe, one second. Oh, and maybe that really is the question that Sefer Dvarim is trying to get us to answer. When can we preserve brotherhood? And it's possible that the answer is we can preserve brotherhood sometimes when the threat is not to destroy us from an ideological or from a ethical perspective. We can preserve brotherhood, and maybe that really should be how we approach our enemies sometimes. When can we preserve brotherhood? And it seems to me that that really is what Sefer Dvarim, when it approaches Moab and Edom, is trying to do. And even Sefer Bamidbar, who's maybe presenting Edom as truly an enemy, is in some way showing us that really Edom, in the end of the day, are still our brothers. There are times that we could preserve brotherhood, and there really are times that brotherhood does not deserve or cannot be reconciled and cannot be preserved. And so, with that, I will wish you a Shabbat Shalom. We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free, but I'll stop sharing.
Yes, I have a question.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering whether Lotatae Edomi can be an allusion to Lot, who obviously was not Mata'e Edomi, he was creator of Edomi. And could it be a pro-Davidic polemic?
I'm so sorry. I didn't fully understand the question.
And
Can you
could
say it
it be
again?
a pro-Davidic polemic justifying the ancestry of David HaMelech?
Lo tita'ev Edomi. But the Davidic dynasty comes from Moab.
Yeah, but that connects with Lot.
Yes, yes. So you're saying that if anything, it's really a question about the Davidic dynasty, because what Dvarim is saying is that we should not allow those from Moab to come into our nation. And so
But it
that,
does
that
say
creates
Lot
a
to
question.
Ta'av. You may not, but Lot to Ta'av, don't reject the product.
But the Lo Tita'ev is about Edom, not about Moab.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's a great question, and the Gemara talks about why we in the end do accept Ruth as a Moabiyah, even though she is from Moab, and we do reject Moab. It's a great question, and that's a more complicated, I think. Yeah, a different shiur. Any other questions from anyone else?
Yeah, yeah.
Go
Thank you
ahead,
very
Ruth.
much, Rebecca. Comment.
Hmm.
There is a very, very big difference between Esav and Moav Ammon.
Hmm.
Esav is our brother, and he is part of the Brit.
Hmm.
Lot is out, he's out of the Brit. He's not part of the Brit Milah. And so he has pieces of Terah that are at one point or at some point in our history it's going to be reincorporated. But Esav is our brother, and he has an axe to grind with Yaakov. Yaakov treated him very badly. Yaakov refused his hospitality. When Yaakov came back, and Esav says to him, "Come, I'll go with you, and you'll come and visit me." And Yaakov said, he lied to him, and he said, "Yeah. I'll be on my way. I'll come soon. I'll come behind." And he never came. So there's a lingering bad feeling. So when Esav comes out armed and brandishes his swords, he's just getting back. And that's it. And
You
then
feel like there's this long-standing bad blood.
Yes, there's unresolved issues between the two brothers. And for Esav to come out, and brandish his swords, it's a show. But then from Moshe's point of view, incorporating the two bechinot, as Moshe tells the story, he wants to emphasize, you know what, let it go. Yaakov did his part. Esav now had his say, and now look, they just put it behind us. He's our brother, and we need to get along with each other.
We need to get past this. Right.
Yeah,
For sure. I do think it's interesting that Dvarim tries to paint Moab like that it does talk about Lot, that it does paint, it's showing that they are family, we are related. And it does the same later on with Ammon as well. It tries to kind of, at the beginning, follow that same line of narrative, I would say. But then later on goes back on itself.
But you can just feel Moshe wanting to make sure that everybody understands that Esau is our brother. We have the same mother and father. And there's the rivalry between the brothers is toxic, and it's better not to pursue it. And just, so he came out and he brandished his swords, fine. So he got back at us, and now we're even. Okay, let's start again.
Now we can move on. Beautiful. Thank you, Ruth. I appreciate it. Sometimes these old sibling rivalries last many generations. Yeah. And maybe we shouldn't let it. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Shabbat shalom to everybody. And I think we were well under 2 hours, so you have lots of time now to prepare for Shabbat. We're excited to catch up to Israel, and Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you.